tracking the amazing growth of the first century church to challenge and inspire the 21st century church. This is Unstoppable Church, Then and Now, recorded on location in Israel, Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Malta and Italy. Bible teacher and church pastor Mike Beaumont is in conversation for the next 30 minutes with David Taverner.
In our last conversation, Mike, Paul was being held in the Roman barracks in Jerusalem for his own safety, really, following the very unpleasant treatment he'd received from the Jewish Supreme Court, as he called it, the Sanhedrin. But how much detail does Luke go into recording what followed?
An incredible amount of detail, David, the sort of detail that you would only get from either being an eyewitness or carefully interviewing the people who had been there. So there's that much detail. We can't look at every aspect of this section, but in quick summary, what happens is the next day, Paul's nephew hears the news of an assassination attempt on Paul, and that's reported. So Paul finds himself protected as the Roman commander quickly transfers him to Caesarea Maritima, the Roman headquarters there on the coast. 5 days later, the Jewish religious leaders travel up to Caesarea for a trial before Felix, the Roman governor, in chapter 24. And it's great how Paul uses that as an opportunity to share his story and his encounter with Jesus, and even to challenge the governor pretty clearly. Once again, God protects him by getting the governor to allow him some freedom and have friends take care of his needs, so not just locking him up in a jail. Now, the surprising thing we find in chapter 24 is he's stuck there for 2 years. We've seen before in our series, haven't we? God doesn't always rush things. Why keep him there for 2 years? Well, the text tells us he was hoping that Paul would bribe him. Well, after those 2 years, Felix was replaced by Festus as governor, and he was a man of much more integrity. Felix was recalled to Rome to answer some charges of irregularities, as it was put. And Paul faces another trial. And eventually Paul gets fed up with all of this and simply says, I appeal to Caesar. So he calls upon his right as a Roman citizen to have his case heard by Caesar. He then appears before King Herod Agrippa when Herod visits Caesarea, and again uses that as an opportunity to share his testimony. And Herod agrees, actually, that Paul hasn't done anything wrong and he could have been freed if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. But since he has to Caesar, he now has to go. And so begins this long journey to Rome. And Paul knew that God had promised him he would end up in Rome and speak to the leaders in Rome. But I suspect he never imagined he would get to Rome in the way it turned out.
So Paul has to be taken from Caesarea on the coast to Rome by sea. What sort of journey was that, and how is that recorded?
Well, we find details of that in Acts chapter 27, and the interesting thing is Acts 27 is one of those we sections. It begins like this: when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from da-di-da-di-da. So Luke is now here. So all of this that we're getting because Luke was an eyewitness to it all.
So he's on the boat, he's on the ship or whatever, on this journey to Rome. So we're going to get quite a detailed description of what that journey was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So we find, first of all, they take little coastal vessels. That was one of the safest ways to travel in those days. So they travel up north as far as Antioch and across to Tarsus, and then along the southern coast of what we would now call Turkey. And then they swap there for a bigger ship, an ocean-going ship, that is heading for Rome. The trouble is it's quite late in the year and they're going to encounter unfavourable weather. Luke notes that it was after the fast. And what was the fast? Well, the fast was the Day of Atonement, and that always falls in late September or early October. Now, even the Romans considered sailing after September the 15th to be suicidal. So Paul warns them not to travel, but the owner of the ship thinks only of one thing: money. I need to get my cargo where I need it to be. And so, not for the first or last time in life, money will overrule and end up leading them all into considerable danger as a fierce storm comes up, just as Paul said it would really, as they sail between Crete and Malta. And despite the sailors doing everything they can, it's clear that they are not going to be able to save the boat.
Paul had certainly faced some tough times, but how did this compare?
Well, this was definitely going to be at the tougher end of tough, without a doubt. And I think probably the best thing we can do is read a section of it to get a sense of the story, and which is all the more powerful because of the place where we're recording this. So here they are in the storm. The sailors are doing the best they can to protect it. It's interesting, Paul's leadership comes to the fore. If you read this story for yourself, you'll see how Paul becomes the leading figure. You know, it's not the captain, it's not the pilot, it's Paul who's giving wisdom and advice. And interesting, leadership, real leadership, always comes to the fore, doesn't he? And he ends up saying to them, look, don't be afraid, because last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some islands. So Paul is absolutely convinced that whatever happens, they're going to be okay. They will be protected, which is the word we've used as the title for this episode. They're going to be protected. Why? Because God has spoken and God has said, you will get to Rome. So let's read on and see what happens. So Acts 27 and verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. But Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. And when they'd eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they didn't recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and wouldn't move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. And once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta.
And here we are on the island of Malta with the sea feet away from where we are and boats going by, and this gives us a sense of what on earth it must have been like for that shipwreck to have happened, I guess very close to where we are.
Yeah, so this is the traditional site of the shipwreck. Obviously, we can't be sure exactly where it was, but it was pretty close to here. If you track the journey that the boat must have taken in those days, blown along by the winds, it would have been here in this northwest corner of this island of Malta, a very rocky island made up of limestone, very craggy at the moment where we are sitting, and we're just looking out with the water only a couple of meters away from us down below, and we're looking out to two tiny islands, and all the local experts and historians think it was one of those two tiny uninhabited islands, they're really very, very small, that the boat ran aground on. So we're very close here to where this incident that we've just read happened, and an incident that Luke records in incredible detail, doesn't he? Did you notice that as we were reading it? It's like, all the details about the ships and the anchors and the boats. This is only something that could have happened from someone who witnessed this, and the story sort of, I'm sure, engraved into his heart. I'm sure he got a good few lunches out of this, telling the story afterwards.
But Paul's faith in the midst of a very real storm is remarkable.
It is incredible, isn't it? And we've called this episode, as I said, Protected, because Paul was absolutely convinced that he was going to be protected, not because he had some sort of, magic bubble around him, not because he thought that as a Christian he was now exempt from all the trials of life. You only have to read 2 Corinthians 11 where he lists some of the hardships that he went through as a Christian to see that that's a nonsense. He knew he was going to be protected because God had spoken. And when we know that God has spoken, whether it's from his word, the Bible, or whether it's through prophetic, or whether it's through an angel appearing to us, as happened here with Paul, and you know that God has spoken, you can then cling on to it. And that's why Paul felt confident. That's why he knew not one of those lives were going to be lost. Interesting, isn't it? They noticed 276 of us, eyewitness detail there again, and not one of those 276 were lost either to the storms round about here. I mean, we're here on a day when it's incredibly still. The water's very, very calm. But it can get very rough here, and it certainly did in those days in the wintertime for those sailing ships. But not one was lost in the storm. Not one was lost to the Roman soldiers. First thing that happened when the ship ran aground and they thought this was going to be it, the Roman soldiers didn't want their prisoners escaping, because if they had, their own lives would have been at stake. So they decided they're going to kill them rather than have them possibly escape. And again, it's only Paul's intervention each time.
Always thinking of others.
Oh, isn't that amazing? Thinking of others. Did you notice how he gets them to have a meal?
Yeah.
14 days. As I read that again recently, I just thought, this is not an overnight squall. This is not an overnight storm. They are in this storm experienced sailors, people who had sailed these waters regularly, knew them like the back of their hand, knew the winds, knew their boat, and they're there for 14 days. But it has become so stressful, they've just stopped eating. And one of the first things Paul does is to say, do you know what? We need some food. We need to get some strength in us. Good advice, actually, sometimes for many of us when we're feeling stressed or feeling down or depressed or in a difficult situation. It can be very tempting to skimp food, but actually you need it. You need the energy that provides, just the way that God has made our body. And I love that care of Paul to both, one, insist they have food, two, to make sure the prisoners aren't killed. Why? Because he knows they're going to be protected and they're going to land right here where we are.
So they land on this island of Malta that he hadn't ever been to before and had never planned to come to, and so didn't, I suppose, quite know what he was going to find here.
No, absolutely not. They got no idea, of course, where they were. They didn't recognise the island note. Now, was that because, the sailors had never been, because the storm was so bad they couldn't work it out? We don't know. But they quickly find out once they get here, and they quickly find out this island is part of God's protection for them as well. So why don't we just read on to the next little section of what happens when they land here at Malta. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. It's actually interesting. Still today, the Maltese people are known for being unusually kind, warm, welcoming, friendly. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. And when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honoured us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. And after 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island.
What can I say? A sequence of somewhat surprising events then, once on the island. I mean, the Viper incident, amazing what was going on there.
It is, isn't it? And here's an example again of this protected idea. If we are doing what God has called us to do, then God is well able to protect us for what he has called us to do. Now, as I said, this is not about us being wrapped up in a cotton wool ball to make sure nothing nasty in life ever comes our way. Lots of nasty things came Paul's way, like this Viper incident, very common in this part of the world. For those of us who live in the UK, where you and I are based, seeing a snake is very, very rare thing indeed, isn't it? But in these parts of the world, they're very, very common. And clearly the viper that bit Paul must have been a deadly, venomous viper. Why? Because of what we read, that the people expected him to swell up or drop down dead. So they knew this was an extremely serious snake bite. But what I love is the sort of almost casual way that Paul deals with it. It's a bit like us, dusting a fly off our arm or something. He just, oh yeah, there's a viper there that had happened to be sleeping in the brushwood he picked up, thrown it on the fire, it had come out and launched at him and had bit him, and he just sort of shakes it off and it falls into the fire.
So though casually just throwing off the viper, their response is fascinating.
It is, isn't it? One, because they are shocked he doesn't fall down dead, and two, because then they decide, well, he must be a god. At first they think, wow, justice. They're thinking of a goddess called Justice. Justice has got him because clearly, he escaped from the shipwreck just where we're looking out to now. But then the viper gets him and, everybody gets their comeuppance eventually is clearly their thinking. But when he doesn't drop down dead, they change their minds and say, he must be a god. Now, while we don't get any detail here about Paul quickly saying, no, I'm not, we know from elsewhere in Acts that the apostles were always very, very quick to correct people about that.
I suppose this point about being protected, I guess you're not saying that, as a believer, that you have a sort of insurance policy guaranteed.
No, absolutely not. And that's really important because sometimes, some Christians can expect that everything should start going well now that you've become a Christian. And let's be honest, some preachers even preach that if you come to Jesus, then from now on your life will be totally blessed. And by that they mean you'll be healthy, wealthy, everything will go well in life, whatever is before you will become yours. Well, I don't find that picture at all in the New Testament. In fact, it's interesting just to look at 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul lists some of the things that he experienced as an apostle for the Lord Jesus. He says, I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Now, whenever I think that, here I am, looking at where he was shipwrecked. Now, if I'm really honest, 1 shipwreck would have been enough for me, and I think I would have been tempted to say to God, can we either call it a day or we do everything by land from now on?
Yes.
But this guy is unstoppable. He just gets off and it does again. So he has 3 shipwreck experiences, of which we've only got the details of 1. I've spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. There's a lot of danger around here and not much cotton wool and not much blessing in inverted commas, everything going right for you. So becoming a Christian does not protect you from the tough knocks of life. What it protects you is it protects you for the purpose to which God has called you. And nothing can stop that from happening. So despite all the things we've seen on this journey, I mean, what have we seen? We've seen riots, we've seen hard journeys, we've seen shipwrecks, we've seen stonings, and yet nothing could stop Paul. Why? Because God had spoken to him. You're going to go to Rome and you're going to take my message there before rulers and leaders. So Paul is absolutely convinced, not that he will now be protected from every thing in life that could go against him and, then turn around when it didn't and say, oh God, that's not fair. I thought you loved me. And I've heard Christians say that, well, if God loved me, why has this happened to me? Well, the simple reason is because we're human beings who live in a world of fallen human beings and a fallen world where things go wrong at times and things go wrong for us at times, just like they do for others. Our loved ones die just like non-Christian loved ones dies. We meet accidents just like non-Christians meet accidents. It's part of living in a fallen world. So we can't guarantee being protected from every single thing that might go wrong in life, but we can guarantee that we will be protected so we can fulfill the calling that God has put on our life, just like Paul was here.
Just remind me again why he was so determined to get to Rome.
Oh, because for him, Rome was the centre of the universe, if we can put it like that, in those days. Rome, of course, all roads lead to Rome, the old saying says, and it was true, literally, as well as metaphorically. So Rome was the power base, and remember, we've seen throughout this series how Paul and the other early Christians always chose strategic cities for the establishing of new churches. Why? So that from there they could go out and spread into the region. Think of Antioch, think of Ephesus, think of Philippi, think of Athens and Corinth. And Rome, of course, was the ultimate place to be, because from Rome there were literally roads to every part of the empire. So not only did you have the opportunity of preaching to the movers and shakers of the day and hoping that some of them might come to Christ, you had the opportunity of planting a church that would be able to send people out across the whole of the Roman Empire, which of course in those days was pretty much the whole world. And what had Jesus said? Well, we've said this so many times in this series. Acts chapter 1 verse 8, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And for Paul, Rome was an absolutely key place for getting to the ends of the earth.
And it seems like wherever he ended up, he attracted the attention of the authorities. And that happened here in Malta as well.
Yeah, but in a good sense this time. Publius, who's the chief official on the island, and by the way, Luke uses the exact correct political term for his office. Again, a reflection of how Luke always was incredibly detailed and accurate in his recording of what happened in both his Gospel and in Acts. And Publius, obviously heard of what was going on the island. It's a fairly small island. And so we read that he welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. Wow! The Maltese really are incredibly generous-spirited, aren't they?
Bearing in mind that Paul was a prisoner.
Yeah, incredible, isn't it? And he welcomes all of them there. And it's while Paul is there that he obviously hears that his father was sick, suffering from fever and dysentery, Luke says. So he goes in and he lays hands on him and he prays for him in the name of Jesus. And the man is healed. And of course, the minute that happens, news spreads across the whole of the rest of the island. And whoever came was cured. And so, little surprise, they honoured us in many ways and helped us to get on with our journey. So Christianity was clearly established here on this island on that occasion. It's interesting, today on this little island of 500,000 people, there are over 400 churches, many of them, by the way, dedicated to St. Paul. St. Paul the whatever, slightly different names for them. And so clearly Christianity got well established from this, in inverted commas, accidental visit. Isn't it funny how God can use the accidental things of life to get us into the place where he wants us to be? We weren't planning on it. I don't think Paul was planning on a shipwreck. It had not gone in his diary, had it? It was one of those things that happened that he would rather didn't happen. And yet, here is the sovereign God using this, not only protecting all these lives, but also using this as an opportunity for the gospel to be able to come to this island and for it still to be rooted there today.
And perhaps a reminder that sometimes we think that we're at the mercy of the authorities, but that's not actually the case.
No, there is someone who sits on the throne, and it's not the government, and it's not the local officials, and it's not your boss. It is Jesus. That's one of the things that comes out clearly in the New Testament. How did the book of Acts begin? It began with Jesus commissioning his disciples and returning to heaven, where he sits at the right-hand side of the Father in a position of all power and authority. And that vision of Jesus ascended, sitting on his throne, keeps cropping up at various points in Acts, sometimes very overtly, like when Stephen sees him in his vision before he is martyred, sometimes behind the scene, like here. There's no mention of Jesus being on his throne here, but clearly he was. Clearly he was working all things together for good. So the one who has the last word is never the government, the local council, your boss, whoever it might be. The one who has the last word ultimately is Jesus, if we will take things to him and trust him with things.
So from here on the island of Malta, does Paul's journey continue towards Rome?
Yeah, absolutely. They'll spend 3 months here. Why 3 months? Well, they're waiting for the better weather to come when they can find another ship to continue their journey. And they absolutely will get to Rome, because Paul knew that God had called him to be there. And Luke will go on to show us, as we look at in our next episode, of how he continued to be protected, how he continued to arrive at Rome. all part of this story that began way back in Jerusalem. And that although we've seen so many things happen on the way, so many hindrances, so much opposition, there has also been so much incredible opportunity. And Jesus has shown once again that his church really is unstoppable church.
Mike Beaumont and David Taverner, travelling from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond to track the amazing growth of the first century church and what that means for the unstoppable church of the 21st century. There are more Bible podcasts from Mike and David on the UCB Player app and major podcast platforms. Check out Jesus Then and Now or Bible Books in 30 Minutes.